Welcome to Huff-N-Stuff Podcast, where we have fun discussing board games, card games, and entertainment for the casual gamer. Brought to you by the Southwest Valley Gaming Group. We invite you to visit our website at huffandstuffpodcast.webs.com. And here are your hosts, Rob Huffin and Han Tiemens.
Episode 8, Wargames.
I want you to remember that no bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country. And then, all this stuff you've heard about America not wanting to fight, wanting to stay out of the war, is a lot of horse dung. Americans traditionally love to fight. All real Americans love the sting of battle. Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser. Americans play to win all the time. I wouldn't give a hoot in hell for a man who lost and laughed. That's why Americans have never lost and will never lose a war. Because the very thought of losing is hateful to Americans. We're going to hold on to him by the nose, and we're going to kick him in the ass. We're going to kick the hell out of him all the time, and we're going to go through him like crap through a goose.
In this episode, we are going to be talking about war games. And why is that? Because people in this industry believe that most of our board gaming, role-playing, card games point back to a time when war games were popular and influenced the hobby today. We are not going to do our normal episode that we usually have with our different segments. I'm just going to give you a number of interviews and roundtables regarding this topic. The first roundtable we're going to have is with our normal contributor, myself, Hans, and a friend of ours, Chad. And then I'm going to talk to Ken about his Warhammer 44. And then I'm going to also have you listen to an interview I did with my brother Chris, who was very into war games in his gaming history. So we will bring you that now. I hope you enjoy. Next is our panel where we talk with Hans, myself, and our friend Chad about war games.
Basically, Avalon Hill is kind of credited with the whole wargaming, board gaming section of the hobby in America, really. TSR came out of it. Dungeons and Dragons came out of TSR. I mean, it has such far-reaching effects. I think when we talk about war games, some of the things that come to mind are, as I have said before, Memoir 44, Small World, Risk, Stratego, Battleship. Heck, even X-Wing and Wings of War are sort of in there. And you could also argue that Battle Lore, Nexus Ops, Twilight Imperium 3, Command and Colors, some of the Avalon Hill histories, some of the other folks like H.G. Wells. It sounds crazy, but H.G. Wells did have a hand in it. Have you guys played some of the other games here, like Risk or Stratego? I'm sure you have.
My exposure to board games is pretty bare. Some of the older, Risk, Stratego, Battleship. Again, it's kind of some of those games that I own but haven't had a chance to play. I have Memoir 44, and you and I are supposed to get together, Rob, and play that sometime soon.
I'm hoping.
Yeah. But I haven't really played too many of the bigger, some of the, Avalon Hill or TSR or even the 3M war games. I'm a little bit intimidated by some of the time commitment and the little hexes that they play on, some of that stuff, and the counters. I'm sure if I ever got into it, I'm sure I would enjoy it.
Sure.
Definitely want to sit down with someone who's familiar with the system and the way to play it.
I think you touched on a really. I think the key word you said was intimidated, and I think these war games can be very intimidating. I remember I barely play any war-style games like that. My earliest exposure, my dad was a big military guy, big history buff. He loved, reading about wars, and he'd buy tactical books and, diaries of generals and read through them and stuff. And he'd always have, like an Axis and Allies or some board game sit on the shelf that we never even really played, but it always just looked so daunting with all the pieces and the huge rule books and measuring and stuff like that. I guess my earliest actual war gaming was probably Warhammer Fantasy. Right. The miniatures, and you, to a degree, you still had to know the rules of each unit, what they could do, the stats for each unit, how far they could move, it became so, daunting to measure out, because if you turned your unit any certain little bit, you had to take that away from their movement, and you had to measure it, and there's a radius, and then it was just way too much.
It sounds like what you're talking about is that was more of a miniatures game, right? What you're talking about?
Yeah, it's still a war game.
No, right? I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that miniature games have that. How do I say this? It definitely has that drawback where, you moved your guy, 2 little inches closer or whatever. Maybe you skewed it a little bit wrong. So there's an argument about that. I was turned off by miniatures early on. My brother and I, when we were young, we got into Napoleonics. Small miniatures. And we got turned off because we would go to a few of these events and people were way too serious, too involved. Something wasn't quite right. Oh, that's not historical, and huge turnoff. And I know when we grew up, I don't know about you guys, but when we grew up, my dad loved watching those old war films. It's almost glamorized it to a degree. The movies, and my wife always comments, those war movies, they're glamorizing war, and that's not how it is. That, I think, made us kind of interested in war games early on when I was young. And this is one of the reasons why I kind of liked it. I built, when I was young, I built plastic models and all that from, like, tanks or airplanes. I was kind of interested in that. So, yeah, when a board game came around or a war game came around, I was kind of interested. How about you, Chad? Did you have anything when you were younger?
I never really got into miniatures, and the only board games I played as a kid were just the standard Monopoly, stuff like that. So I never really had much of a wargaming past until, I kind of started, buying a couple of the, like I said,
designer board games.
Yeah, more. And those, it seems like, the Memoir 44 or, Small World, they seem more accessible because they don't have some of the, the ridiculously detailed rules. And I'm excited to kind of try that out. And maybe that'll be an avenue to playing some of the bigger ones.
When I was a kid, we used to play with those little plastic soldiers when we were kids, little green army men. When I learned about Memoir 44 and all that, I was like, that'd be kind of cool. Because they're like the green little army men. It's like going back in time almost.
Yeah, Memoir 44 is probably the only one that I've heard on a regular basis that, I'd be willing to try, just because it seems like it's a little different from those other, I don't want to say more mainstream, but just... maybe easier to handle your first time round with it.
Right. I don't want to say dumbed down, but they've streamlined it to the point where it makes it a fast-paced game, and you're not getting involved with the minutia of a war game. Because when I think of war game, I think of like an Avalon Hill game where they've got those really cheap little cardboard chits, and on like a symbol where it was the rectangle with the cross in it, and underneath that it had the number of the unit on it. And it had different colors for the different units, like the paratroopers were this. And I know my brother, when he was in college, he got all into it, and he went out and bought some of these war games. I just didn't even want to touch them. The rule book was like homework. You think that some of these board games now are homework. That was nothing compared to the Avalon Hill games. They gave you a whole history of the scenario you were playing. And then these guys that are into history were kind of history buffs. And they knew all the history. It's almost like Avalon Hill had to give some background so they go, hey, this game is legit.
Yeah, I guess something that might, talking about this background and this history, something that I think, would maybe draw me more into like war style games is, we see movies or books all the time where like they identify a specific character or a specific person within that war moment. And maybe they just more theme added to it. Okay, this is taking place in, the Cold War. This is taking place in, Stalingrad. But let's focus more on, the horror that these soldiers went through, or the difficulties just to survive the night. You're surviving a bunker for the night, and you have to deal with cold, and you have to deal with, snipers and silent attackers and bombings and lack of sleep and things of that nature. If they got more into the psyche of a soldier and more into, a certain situation with a more of a deep theme, kind of like, lack of a better thought, Arkham Horror, where, you're dealing with the sanity of it as well as the the physicality of it.
And you know what you just described sounded a lot like the very first Call of Duty video game. You actually were witnessing some of the events in history. Like I remember there was this. I played Call of Duty a lot, and back in the day. And I remember this one part where they were in Stalingrad. They would talk about being in the sewers and all the struggles that those guys had to go through. So what you're talking about sounds very familiar. These video games, and I think video games have been able to capture that, giving you into that moment. I don't think board games quite gotten there yet, but I think they're getting there. Most people are turned off by the whole war theme. That's why they try to keep it light, like Small World. Small World is a perfect example of this.
I mean, I guess maybe something comes to my mind of, like a Robinson Crusoe survival, group thing. You have your platoon. Your platoon has been separated from everybody else. But then is it no longer a war game? Is it more of an adventure game? But you can at least get more people excited about World War II games if it was maybe more of an adventure type versus a, straight up, my unit's going to, forward march this way and I have to reload my artillery and things of that nature.
And I think that adventure games have, especially with the advent of, Robinson Crusoe, and there's that one game called Lost Valley, and it's like I think you're camping or something, and you get lost or you're hiking, and you get lost, and you have to find your way back from the wilderness. And it has a similar feel to it, like it's a survival sort of game. And I think you've hit on something that could really work. It's too bad they don't have a game like that, where you're in war and you're behind enemy lines, like Snoopy did in the cartoons, where he's behind enemy lines, he's shot down, he's trying to get back. I mean, it's a cartoon, and it's kind of funny, but that's what made that little snippet of that cartoon interesting. Because he was surviving the war or whatever.
Or maybe just add a mechanic of, in between rounds, there's a upkeep phase where you have to test the sanity of your troops, or if they break out more, if a certain event happens, say you went to attack another, platoon and you guys, suffered very badly, then, there's repercussions to it in more of a, emotional sense than just a tactician or tactics mindset.
Chad, what do you think? Do you think that board games' future will see more of these things?
I think so. I think it seems like, in order to grow the hobby, I think, everyone can. It seems like more and more people are playing games, and I think as more people get into it, it'll kind of open up different avenues to get into different types of games. I know that, I'd never even heard of a war game, outside of Risk or the Basics, a year ago, and now I could probably name off quite a few of them, although I just haven't had a chance to play them. So I think, even some of the games, it seems like they're as different game mechanics. The card drafting mechanic in 100 Acres of Snow. It's kind of it's a war game, but they've kind of taken in that card draft mechanic. And I've only played it online once or twice, and I always get killed. So again, it's one of those. It's hard to get into a game whenever you're playing with someone that's that much better than you and familiar with the game.
Right. Well, that's the whole different argument for another day. But yeah, knowing the game for any game is going to be key.
Yeah, but that 100 Acres of Snow, it seemed more like it's almost like a card game, and you have little pawns on the map. So I'm not sure if that's a war game. I'm sure it's kind of one of those hybrids, but I think that's kind of the way it's going to go.
I was talking about this someone the other day, and I was telling them, and we both agreed that hybrids are really the future of board gaming, where you take a lot of these games, they've got a little bit of everything. They've got a little trading, they've got dice rolling, they've got everything. I just sold an extra copy of Mage Knight to Hans here. If that's not a hybrid, I don't know what isn't.
Right, there's a little bit of deck building, there's a little bit of, rolling, there's, strategy, hand management. It's a little bit of everything. Definitely a hybrid.
People into our hobby, just like I believe that some of these war gamers now are into our hobby, playing Memoir 44 and Tide of Iron. I know I've been recently looking at Tide of Iron these days. It's a Fantasy Flight production. It looks amazing, and I'd love to have it, although at $100-something a pop, I'm not sure I can afford it. And and that's the other thing, getting someone to play it with you is the tough. I know you said you'd be interested in playing it, Chad, but...
Yeah, it's nice to either start with someone who's willing to teach you the game, or have someone that's kind of starting from the same base as you of not knowing the game at all. That way you can kind of learn it together.
You're on the same level.
Right.
Do you think the war games are, maybe a little bit more competitive or aggressive than those normal adventure games or press your luck games?
I think so, and I think that's what turns some people off too. I know my wife would be like, no way, I'm not playing, Memoir 44 or something. There's no way I'm going to play it. Because it does have a little bit of aggression involved with it, I believe. Because like when I play Call of Duty on my Xbox, I'm swearing at the top of my lungs. That's like testosterone to the 10th power. People are really competitive in that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing because I play games, say like Spartacus. And Spartacus, you're very aggressive. You're very competitive. People are trying to outwit you, have more influence, try to kill you in the arena with the other gladiators. But it's just like a different mindset than you're lining up as this army and you're coming to kill me. It's an interesting dynamic that it's so different when the goal is the same thing, but the way that you're presented to get to that goal makes you feel a different way about it.
And you could technically argue that game is sort of a light war game in essence, because there's two people squaring off. I mean, a fight they've often called wars. I mean, you'll watch these big bouts between these fighters on TV, and it's like the war of the century, and they have so-and-so against so-and-so. It's like war. So you could technically say that's kind of a war, too. I mean, of course, I'm stretching this a little bit. I really believe, you could classify that also. These kind of games are going to draw in these war gamers.
Instead of our normal segments in our podcast, we thought it would be interesting to talk about game trades. And Chad, our friend, is very into game trading, so let's go on to that.
I thought that it would be interesting to sort of not do the questions and answers so much, so technically it's not questions and answers, but I wanted to ask Chad a few questions. He was talking to me about something really interesting that's in the board game world I don't really have any knowledge of. Now, tell me again, what is the title of this? You told me earlier, I can't remember.
It's called a math trade.
Okay, a math trade. Now, I know it has something to do with Board Games Geek, right?
Correct. It's on Board Game Geek.
Okay.
And what you do is someone has to host it. And there's usually one a month or one every other month, and you basically go to the thread and you post which game you're willing to trade. And then once you do that, you have to go to what's called the online want list generator. It's a separate website. It's a separate part of it's a separate system where then you go on there and you'll look at the different games that you want. And when you click on a game that I'm sorry, I kind of messed that up. The first thing you do is you post the games you're willing to trade.
Right.
And then you go to the want list generator, and then you look for the games that you want to trade for. And then whenever you click on that, it'll ask you, will you trade X for X, Y, and Z? What were you willing to trade it for? So you can kind of list the different games that you'll trade it for. And from that, it goes and hundreds of people.
Now, do they rate your games that you're willing to trade for? Do they rate it yours is only a 10, and so I can't trade with a 1?
No, it's really... it shows the rating, the BGG ranking on the want list generator, so you can see what the games are rated. But really, what happens is if somebody wants your game and you want someone else's game, it's a really convoluted algorithm that they use, and they'll try to find which trade will generate the most either games traded or people involved in the trade. But it's thousands of games that get traded
in one transaction.
In one transaction, so instead of like me trading to you, you trading to Hans trading to me. It involves 500 people, so they can conceivably I could trade off like a $5 game and get a $100 one back. But chances are that isn't going to happen because if someone's got a really good game, they only want a handful of games they'd be willing to trade it for.
That's crazy. I can't even think of that.
Is this now trade for keeps or trade for a certain amount of time and then they get it back?
It's trade for keeps. It's just I'm willing to trade. Let's just say King of Tokyo. I've kind of played it. I'm not playing it anymore. I put on there I'm willing to trade it. Then I go through the 1,000 or usually 2,000 or 3,000 games that people are willing to trade, and I'll say that I'm willing to trade King of Tokyo for Agricola or Le Havre or whatever. Right. And if someone takes my game, then I can only trade my game for something that I want to get back. So sometimes you don't trade your games. There's plenty of times where I've posted a game and been willing to trade it, but it just didn't work out.
Like someone didn't want what you had?
Yeah, or just didn't work out into the trade because, even if someone wants it, it still has to kind of work out that somebody wants their game in turn, and in turn someone has to want that one. So it can get pretty crazy.
And now, when you make your list, are you locked into that list, or will the generator kind of recommend, well, this is a game kind of like one that you wanted, or are you locked into only the titles that you listed that you'd want?
You can kind of go through them all. It definitely links up to your want list or want and trade list that you have on Board Game Geek, so it's, if you own a game, it's highlighted, I think, light blue or blue, and if you're wanting a game, it's highlighted green. That way, because it can be pretty daunting looking through all those games. So a lot of times I just go through looking for the highlighted green games that I've kind of put on Board Game Geek that I'm interested in trading for, and then I'll just kind of click on ones, and you have decisions to make. Sometimes if you really want a good game, you're like, I'm only going to trade this game if I get this handful of games. Otherwise, I'm not going to trade it. And so, it means it kind of limits your ability to trade it, though. So. And
how many times have you done this?
I think I've done it 5 or 6 times. And the first time I didn't trade, I was probably too greedy or too picky in what I wanted, and I was 0 for, I think, 5. I was like, man, maybe that's how it always is. And so the next time I kind of opened up my want list a little bit and kind of was willing to trade. So
you were thinking that you wanted one specific thing.
Yeah, or maybe it's 4 or 5 things, and then the second time around I kind of so
it was like instead of being 5 things, you were like interested in like 30 things,
or 100 things. And so the second time I was like, I'll maybe trade 1 or 2. I think I had to trade 8 games, and the way it works out also is the sender has to pay the shipping. So that can be between $5 for a little game or $12, $13 for a bigger game.
Yeah, but if you're only getting it for 12 or 13, it's not a big deal.
No, it just depends on what you get, though. I mean, sometimes I know I traded one of them. I ended up trading away because I wasn't really paying attention. I traded away Wits and Wagers, I think, for Hanabi, and
that's a good trade.
Yeah, but Wits and Wagers was big, so I probably paid $13, and plus I had to buy the Wits and Wagers at some point, so it probably cost me around $20. Because I think I got Wits and Wagers at one of my Goodwill finds. But I paid $20 for Hanabi, which I could probably find for less than $20. So
so you have to be careful, basically.
Yeah, you can definitely get the wrong side of it if you're not paying attention. But I was kind of happy to get it at the time. I don't think Hanabi was widely available here in the United States. So.
Oh yeah.
So it was a German language version.
How is it protected? Is there like a moderator? Does Board Game Geek kind of?
There's a moderator because you can also post gift cards, and I think you can post Geek Gold. And things like that. And so
really?
Yeah. And one of the rules is you can't, trade a $10 gift certificate and receive a $30 gift certificate. So you can't trade up in that.
Well, yeah, that seems, a no-brainer, so to speak.
And then there's people, I'm sure there's been, I've probably traded, through the math trades or just with random people, 80 trades or so. And I've never had a game not show up. I've never had a game show up in bad condition. I've had some little things here and there, but nothing that I would ever give bad feedback on. And it's it's the greatest hobby in the world. It's the greatest site, I think, because everyone's so nice and so helpful.
It's true.
And
everyone's there for a reason. They want another game. And
right.
Why would someone mess that up?
Well, yeah, you'd be surprised, but still, those people usually get ferreted out.
Yeah.
I think.
So the people that on the math trades, people that don't do it, they just won't be allowed back in the next time. And I've never had an issue, and it doesn't seem like there's too many of them. But there is a moderator, a guy that kind of hosts it.
Well, that's cool. A few times, Hans and we had talked about on our podcast, if you want to use game, we talked about, I love used games, because usually you can get a pretty good deal. Board games are expensive, like we've talked about before. But one of the times here, I went and I had got at the used game sale at our board game shop, I got Thunderstone, and I got it for like $10 or something. So I was like, oh, great. But then I started, listening to these online things, and they're like, oh, no, you have to play Supreme Thunderstone or Ultimate Thunderstone. And how you do that is you take all the Thunderstone expansions and you put them into one gigantic thing, and you've got this table filled with cards. So I'm like, okay, well, now I've got to get some expansions, but I'm not going to pay full price for them. There's no way. So I went on to Board Game Geek, and I contacted a guy, and he goes, well, I have a friend, he posted it on here, but if you give me, so we did something like a 3-way trade deal. And at first I was really nervous. I wasn't sure I wanted to do it because I get this weird vibe I'm going to get ripped off or something. I just got this weird vibe. I was like, oh my God, I'm not sure I want to do this. Jenna was like, no, I don't want to do this. I don't want you to do this. She was like totally against it. But I talked to the guy a few times, and he goes, don't worry, man, I've got my ranking on here, I guess. You have a certain ranking or something.
You've got a reputation. I mean, people, you don't want to be that guy, that come through. So, and then, with the trades, you can basically see feedback. Was it positive or negative?
Right.
And, it's similar to eBay or Amazon. No one wants to have a negative feedback.
Sure.
You can always see, if you're trading with someone that's, for whatever reason, got negative feedback before, and then you have the decision to make. But I've never even really noticed that much negative feedback because, again, it's, in the hobby, on that website especially, it seems like everyone's pretty upfront and no one wants to, you know, you kind of see if they're active on the website. And if they are, they don't want to kind of ruin their reputation by
right.
slighting someone.
And this transaction I had when going back to that Hunterstone purchase were great. It was in perfect shape. In fact, if anything, half of the cards were sleeved. So I got sleeves on top of it all. So it was like, wow, this is a great deal.
Speaking of sleeves, I think I finally took my next step in like true board gaming, world. I sleeved like 3 games this last week, and I'm just super excited. I was like, finally, I'm doing this. I've been seeing other people with it. I'm like, it's about time.
What brand did you use?
I just got. They had them at the. I was buying a game, and they had them at the checkout. So I just got. I think they were Fantasy Flight because it was a Fantasy Flight game. So I just got because they make it really easy. They color code and tell you how many of each you're gonna get. I'm sure could have gotten a better deal, but I was just so excited to do sleeving that I was okay with paying the $2.99 for a 50-pack of regular sized.
I always sit down and I say, well, gee, what game do I play a lot of? Because I won't sleeve a game. And I was like, not only is this getting expensive, but it's kind of time consuming. And if a game is just sitting on my shelf, it was kind of silly for me to sleeve it if I rarely play it.
It's a great add-on for like CSI if you have to have $100. If you're at 90, 95, I think you can get a pack of them for $5 to get you over the $100 limit for free shipping, so that way you don't have to buy a game. So I think that's where I've gotten mine before is from CSI.
Yeah.
To bump it over the $100 limit.
Yeah, I think sleeving is a lot of fun. It's just a great feel.
It feels great.
I did Love Letter, Blood Bowl, and The Resistance, and the next time I broke it out, I was like, oh man, it feels just so much more legit.
I love it. I love it. The only problem is it's not easy to shuffle your cards, though. That's the problem.
Yeah, and you have to rethink the box, because when I did Blood Bowl, I couldn't...
You couldn't get it all in.
I couldn't get it all in. I mean, it ended up doing really well. I ended up organizing so each different team had their own little baggie, but, I mean, yeah, I couldn't be happier. I was very excited.
Yeah. So anyway, Chad, I want to thank you for stopping by and doing this with us. We were very interested in your thoughts here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I wanted to talk to Ken today about Wargames because Ken has some definite experience in the Wargame genre. Why don't you jump in here and tell me a little bit about what your past is about with Wargaming?
Well, I did about 5 or 6 years or so of Wargaming. I started out in college with Warhammer 40K. And I mean, I loved the story, loved the backstory and everything, and I got heavy into the Orc army with that, just because I loved just the way that they worked, the way that they functioned, and like a big thing with that one is that there's like psychic powers and whatnot, but the orcs for some reason don't have psychic powers.
Sure.
The extent of their psychic powers was that if enough orcs thought something was true, it became true.
Oh,
like
okay.
There's one of the armies they have is the speed freaks, and they think that any piece of orc machinery that's painted red goes faster, so it does.
Huh. So, okay, what you're saying is that the Warhammer Fantasy, right?
No, 40K.
40K. I'm sorry. I'm not very knowledgeable about that world. This is a fantasy-based type of war game, right?
It's a futuristic.
Base.
There's two Warhammers. There's Warhammer Fantasy, and then there's Warhammer 40,000.
Okay, and that's what I think I'm getting confused about the two.
Yeah.
Because I think that Hans had talked about in our first episode that was one of the things that he was interested in his youth was the Warhammer Fantasy part.
And Warhammer Fantasy is more like your classic Lord of the Rings, classic high fantasy, elves and dwarves and goblins.
Okay.
Warhammer 40,000 takes place in the future. There's genetically created superhumans called Space Marines that wear these giant
I've
clunking power armor. Think of it like the book version of Starship Troopers.
Okay.
Not the movie. I mean, the movie's great and I love the movie, but the book version, they're in these giant power armor that they have to use every ounce of strength they have just to move these mechs. But it's not just limited to humans. There's space elves called Eldar. There's still orcs. They're just orcs.
Now, I've heard about this whole hobby and how the thing about it that is so cool and so interesting is that it gives you the ability to tailor your army when you go out to play or whatever. It's almost like its own hobby as far as like building things.
It definitely is. I mean, when you get a box of whether it's Warhammer or Fantasy or 40K, none of it is assembled, none of it is painted. And you have to actually cut out the pieces, put it all, super glue it all together. Some people actually get like a little Dremel and drill and pin everything, and you make it the way that you want it. You paint it the way that you want it, and I mean, people only ever see at the game shops people playing the game.
Sure.
But that's only about, I wouldn't even say, it's like a giant iceberg. You aren't even seeing half of the story.
Sure.
Because outside of the game itself, you're painting, you're modeling, you're cutting and sculpting these models. And even after you're done with that, you have to pull out whatever rule book you have and crunch the numbers and create an army.
Right.
Because it's not, okay, I have these guys, you have those guys, let's have at it and shoot each other. No, there's a point system, and each unit, each model is worth a certain number of points.
Okay.
And I mean, you'll go in and it'll be a 1,500 point game.
Right.
And then you tailor your army list based so that it's at or as close to 1,500 points without going over.
Okay. Well, now, I know that in my past, my brother and I, we had both gotten into Napoleonic 15mm war games. Now, we never really got to actually play the war games themselves because it turned into almost more of a hobby of just trying to buy all those packs of men and assemble them on we put them on a little board and we assembled them and painted them all. So it almost became that. Plus, we didn't really know of anybody who was doing that sort of thing.
And that's really not unheard of. I have a couple of friends back east who they're and their brother, they buy the models for Warhammer 40,000 and put them together.
Right.
They don't even play. I mean, there's one or two shops that they can go to, but the shops are in one city and they're like an hour away.
Sure. So, and that, I think, hinders a lot of people because it seems like war games, and in particular the certain genre that you're involved with, there's not as many people in that genre as compared to, let's say, the board gaming industry. There's just more people that are more interested in just general board gaming than there is the war game genre.
And that definitely is true. I mean, I started out playing these war games. Well, even before that, I was playing Dungeons and Dragons, but I think that's how most of us started.
Yeah, most people played it at one point.
I played Dungeons and Dragons.
Childhood.
I had friends that played Warhammer 40,000. I got into that. I left the college town that I was in. Still played at a shop back in the hometown that I was in. That shop closed. I got out of it. And then I went to another game shop that was in the same town, and they were playing a totally different war game called Hordes and War Machine. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about that is, unlike Warhammer 40,000 and Warhammer Fantasy, where you can't play the two against each other,
okay,
Hordes and War Machine can be played against each other. It's all part of what's called the Iron Kingdoms.
Sure.
And like the Hordes, or the War Machine portion of it, is you have these magic users who basically have the ability to, with their strength of will, order and command these giant bipedal steam-powered tanks.
Okay.
That they can go and they can just beat the living daylights out of anybody.
Interesting. Okay.
And that's the War Machine side of it. The Hordes side of it is a similar concept, but instead of having giant mechanized steam-powered robots, you have giant monsters. And it's not just about the models and doing all that. The backstory is amazing for all of these games.
Right.
I mean,
I know there's a whole world there that's really interesting.
When I was first getting into Hordes, there were two armies I was torn between just because of the design for the models. And then I read the backstory for both of them, and I'm like, okay, I have to go with the Legion of Everblight.
Right.
Just because there's nothing more amazing than a group of trolls and elves trying to bring about the demise of the world by summoning an evil dragon.
Well, I know that there's been, like, I've heard a few podcast folks talking about this whole thing, and they just were like going on and on about it, is just how that hobby part of it is infused with the gameplay. And what I mean is that is what is fun about being involved with that, is to create something that is tailored for you and is something you have chosen and that you get to, and they're yours. It's not like a board game where you break it out and it's just like, bam, this, I'm going to pick this guy and I'm going to, like, I'm going to be this guy, like in Arkham Horror, I'm going to be this guy and he's got certain special abilities and bam, we're off to the races. Where Warhammer and these kinds of things, it's like really involved because you get really frustrated when, if you're playing a war game, that your guys die.
Yeah, and there's different types of war games. There's the giant total battlefield war games like Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000.
Right.
There's squad-based war games like Hordes and War Machine, and there's even more fine-tuned ones than that, where it's skirmishing almost. It's like you have maybe 5 or 6 models on the board, and you're after each game, you have like one of your characters might die, and you roll a die, and depending on what you roll on that die, the character might be dead, the character might just be wounded,
right.
The character might actually be kidnapped and sent to become a pit fighter. Mm-hmm. And then after so many games, he might come back weaker, or he might not come back as strong, but he'll have more experience, and you can actually level up these characters.
Neat.
And that's Mordheim.
Neat. Well, I know that each genre has a certain type of people. And what I mean by that is that I know that on Friday nights over at Imperial Outpost, where we go gaming on Thursday nights, on Friday nights they have war game nights. And I went over there to see if I could sell some of my Napoleonics, because I don't really use them anymore. I thought, if it was going to go to a good home, I'd rather them be able to use them rather than just these things sitting in my house. So I went down there, and it was quite an interesting little trek. I walked in, and on one side it was historical gaming, and on the other side of the room it was this Warhammer universes.
And even just the crowd that these games pull in, they have a totally different mentality and mindset than board gamers.
They do.
I mean, I loved the games of like Hordes and War Machine, but part of the reason why I got out of it was just that some of the people that I was playing with were complete and total snobs.
Sure.
And we had a league that we would play in that was sponsored by the shop, and I would look online for all the stats for the league, be like, well, how did this happen and that happen and that happen? Oh, well, we had an extra game night at so-and-so's house on this night. And it's like, okay, why wasn't I invited? And it's just, some of them, unfortunately, I hate to say it, have kind of a, not even an elitist, but a snooty attitude, like they look down their nose at you if you don't know what you're doing or if you don't know what game they're playing.
Sure. And I think that's going to be ultimately a detriment to the hobby if you're going to be like that. I know that when I walked in on Friday nights with Dor there, right away 3 or 4 guys came up to me from the historical side of the war games, and they were very friendly, but it was weird. It was like the Warhammer side, the guys didn't want to have anything to do with me.
Yeah, they kind of stare and glare at you, and like, who is this person? Why are they here?
Right, so I went over and I was like, I talked to the one guy there, and I was like, oh, I'm just, interested in looking or whatever, and so one of the guys very nice, So I guess it just depends on who you're talking to, I guess.
There are some people where they put on that tough guy facade, but once you get to know them, they're just a giant teddy bear.
Yeah, I'm sure that's probably true. But it is kind of funny. I do find that there's more of a younger crowd with the Warhammer, and then the historical stuff. I'm being general here. I'm generalizing here, but I found that to be true. Like, the history guys are usually middle-aged guys.
And I think a reason for that is the price tag. A lot of the World War II games and things of that sort, they don't have the same price mark that like Warhammer or Warhammer 40,000 have. And I mean, you're looking at just one box for one squad. Not even a complete squad, because you still have to go and buy the commander model. Mm-hmm. Is $45.
That's just crazy.
And I mean, I think about it and I ponder it, and it's like, I just want to get some of these to paint, just because I'm sitting around the house when I get out of work and I got nothing to do.
Sure.
But then I look at that price tag and it's like, yeah, $45 just for the model. Then I got to go and I got to buy a scalpel and I got to buy paint and primer, and
it's completely crazy.
What am I going to do with it once I'm done? Put it on my shelf?
And I kind of in that same place as you are. I just been trying to be more and more careful with what I spend, because when you get married and you've got responsibilities and stuff, things change. When I was single and I was in college, boy, I was spending all kinds of cash on hobbies and whatnot.
There's that disposable income factor that kind of diminishes over years.
Exactly. Now, I do know that there's been recently some games cropping up in the board game world that has been directly influenced by these two genres, the historical wargaming and the fantasy wargaming, which, like the Warhammer series. I know that there was Fantasy Flight just recently in the late December, I think, really. It was their Battleground series, I believe.
Yeah, I think it was Battleground or Battle Lore.
Battle Lore, I think that's it. And apparently all the reviewers were all enamored with it. And it kind of boiled it down to its essence of gameplay. And boy, it has all kinds of miniatures and stuff. And I'm kind of interested in playing this one.
And the Battle Lore system is solid, but even outside of that, there's other games that still fall into the fantasy world. Like there's Chaos in the Old World, I know is one by Fantasy Flight, that they did that's based in the Warhammer Fantasy. And they actually also have a living card game that they just ended.
I've always kind of wanted to get back into wargaming to a certain degree. The storage part and the expense part I've always tried to avoid, especially now. But one of the things I was kind of looking into is Tide of Iron and Memoir 44, because I like the historical wargaming, although I'm not opposed to trying, like these other ones, like we were talking about, these other fantasy ones. I'm all for that. It just, what has the best systems, what has the best price point, and that's kind of where I'm at this point.
And there's even miniatures games that are technically classified as war games where you don't even have to assemble and paint the models. I mean, there was one that came out a while ago called AT-43 that kind of had that futuristic war where you had the bipedal robot battle tanks, and then there's another one that is actually still pretty popular now. It's called Dust Tactics.
Right, Dust is very popular, yeah.
And I mean, I look at these models and I'm just like, I want that model. I don't want to play the game,
exactly,
but I want a giant bipedal American tank.
It's true, they're amazing looking. The Fantasy Flight X-Wing game with the miniatures are kind of like that. Of course, it's different. It's airplanes and stuff in space, obviously, but that looks really interesting.
Oh, spaceship games like that's a whole other can of worms.
There's
Silent Death is another very, very popular, where I think it's almost based on like the Star Trek system.
Right. No, and it is, but I mean, technically those fall into that same realm where it's a war game and there's miniatures and that sort of thing. I've been itching to play more war games these days.
I've been hankering just to do the modeling portion of it.
Yeah, it's true, because I'll tell you, and I'm pretty sure that it has a lot to do with the ability of manufacturing these days. It's just gotten better and better. The machines that produce these products have just, the technology has gotten so much better that I saw the other day, I borrowed a game from Donna, Gears of War. Now, this game wasn't supposed to be all that great, and it's not a war game per se, but what I mean is that the miniatures in it, they were plastic miniatures, and the detail on these things were just amazing. I was blown away. I was like, man, I wish I could go out and just buy those and just paint them up. They're cool.
And that was another reason that I was really drawn into Hordes and War Machine. And the models are gorgeous, and unlike Fantasy Flight, where they're all, or not Fantasy Flight, Games Workshop, where they're all plastic
well, we were
models.
just talking about that, so that makes sense. But.
A lot of plastic models come from Games Workshop. Back when I started playing Hordes and War Machine, they were all pewter models.
Yeah.
And they were nice, thick, heavy models.
Right.
But now I guess even Privateer Press, the company that makes Hordes and War Machine, is starting to get more into the plastic models.
Well, I don't know if you've seen recently, but Reaper Miniature has a series called Bone. I believe it's a resin/plastic based product, I think. I'm not even sure, to be honest with you. But apparently the reason why it's becoming so popular is because it's cheap. It's way cheaper than actual metal, and they're almost, I think, even more sturdy than the pewter would be. So,
well, the pewter models were always a pain because they after they take the model out of the mold, or before they put it in the mold, they spray it with almost like a Crisco or like a lubricant coating. So before you can even start to model, you have to take a little bit of dish soap,
you got to
soak it, and let it just sit in there for a couple of hours.
Right.
Then after that's done, you got to rinse it off, and then you can finally go out and start modeling.
Going back to this whole thing with miniature gaming, I think what you're going to find in the future, and I could be wrong here, I don't know, but I think that there's the price point and the quality are adjusting themselves to make it more available to more people, which is a great thing.
Yeah, it is definitely becoming more accessible, but at the same time, there's other games out there that, like Silent Death, unless you really know what that is, you're not going to hear about it, or even one of the less popular, or a couple of the less popular Games Workshop games, like Mordheim, where it's a skirmish, like squad-based.
Sure.
You have maybe 6 to 10 models on the board at the most. Or another one that Games Workshop does is Blood Bowl. There's no real following for Blood Bowl here anymore, and I don't even know if Games Workshop still makes the models.
I don't think they do anymore, no.
I think that you have to find whatever army you want to do, go buy the Warhammer models, and then you go online to Games Workshop, and you can buy a blister there that will let you interchange the pieces for Blood Bowl pieces.
Sure. We should end the interview here because we're probably going to be going over our time limit here. But I want to thank you, Ken, for talking to me about this. Very interesting because the Warhammer side of it I'm not very familiar with. So I appreciate you coming in and telling me about it.
Well, thanks again for having me, and hope to be on again soon.
Okay, well, we'll see you later.
Now, because this is a different and unique podcast outside of our normal programming, I thought I would throw in an interview that I did back about a month ago when I went to California and I interviewed my brother. So here it is. Hello, and we are here in California in my brother's house, Chris. Say hello, Chris.
Hello.
And I thought it would be interesting to get my brother interviewed on gaming and board gaming because, frankly, Chris is the one that I talk most about, or most to, about games, and we seem to talk on the phone quite a bit. Chris, let me ask you, what is the first designer board game that you tried? What's the first one?
Well, back in the 90s, I had some friends that I ran across, and I just kind of walked into it was almost one of those old poker backroom games type things. I mean, you could imagine smoke and the whole thing, and they were playing this game called Junta, and it was introduced to this, and I didn't know. I mean, the only games Rob and I played when we were kids were, the common Monopoly and Battleship and those sorts of games.
Right.
And, so I sat down and, it was a little bit hardcore as far as I remember it, but, I just walked away. If you don't know Junta, it's a kind of a cutthroat game. It's an older game. And, they did some reprinting and whatnot. And if you were to look at it now, there's many flaws and whatnot to it. But at the time I played it, it just kind of blew me away. And I said,
yeah,
wow.
I mean, for its time, it was probably pretty advanced.
Well, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't know other than that was the game that I kind of ran across, and I had such a great gaming experience that one time I ran out and picked up my own copy, but nobody I knew at the time was ever playing board games. I think at the time, it seems to me that there wasn't a widespread use of games. I mean, you had your Avalon games. And,
right, it seems like Avalon and those war type games were probably the most at the time. I from what I remember, late '80s, early '90s.
Oh yeah,
it seems like that the war game genre was the one that was really kicking butt at the time.
Well,
popular.
I think there was, you almost had quite a dichotomy between the two. You had your just basic, family games,
Mm-hmm.
And then you had these hardcore, little tiny chits, thousands of them, and
right.
It was something that, in fact, I even ran out and picked up. Sometime later, I went out and picked up a Civil War game, and you remember we played this Napoleonic game called 1809.
Yeah,
and
it was a little too complex for me.
It was complex for both of us, and it was just something that we weren't ready to kind of jump into because I think at the time they were designing games in such a way that were meant for just these, just hardcore type of games.
Right.
And these guys sitting around, strategizing and very, very technical. I think, even now I wouldn't play those games, but I didn't know any different at the time.
Well, at the time, I think they were kind of hot and new, and everyone was like, "What is this?" That kind of thing. So, I know that there was a story that you should I'd like to hear again. Told me about when we were in high school, and both of us were in band, by the way, that you and this guy named Troy Lyman would play B-17 Queen of the Skies in this back of the bus. We were going somewhere on some competition or something, right, when you used to do that?
Yeah, I mean, for those people that don't really know, marching band, you're going off to some competition once in a while. And
right.
You're spending oftentimes you're in the back of a bus, you're just, most people fall asleep, chat or whatever. And
right.
One of the guys that I knew in band, he actually had a game and he brought it along for something to do in the back. Again, in the back of the bus, we just sit there and play games. We just had so much fun doing it. In fact, I contacted him, just a few months back, and he said he actually still has the game, and it's pretty funny. It's like legendary. And in fact, I was considering picking it up just for nostalgia reasons. I looked at the components, and again, it was designed, and I mean, this is 1987, 86, I think it was.
I don't know when the dates were.
Yeah, I was 15, so it was probably 85, 86. And
you're dating yourself, you know that. So
of course, doesn't matter to me. You talk about the era of design, and it's simple. Basically, this game is you're flying. You're part of the 8th Air Force, flying B-17s over Germany, and part of the game is that you figure out roll of the dice. I kind of forgot how it's determined, but I remember the first game that we had played. Troy's going, well, this game. It's kind of tough, You're going to come back with a lot of, your crew's going to be dead. And I was like, oh, okay, let's give it a try. And the first run was a milk run. It was real easy. Came in, came back, and no harm, no foul, right? We successfully bombed the mission. And then he's like, oh, okay, let's try it again. And, of course, the next one was straight into the heart of, Berlin or something. And I walked back, and I think the aircraft didn't even survive. I mean, everybody died, And what they do is, again, there's fouls to the game if you see it now. I mean, you've got all these charts and to determine the angle of attack of the German fighters and the kind of, I mean, it gets really detailed. I mean, you're not even talking about Messerschmitts, but you're talking about the Focke-Wulfs. So all of that.
When I first saw this game, I mean, I guess we could probably kind of go off on a little tangent here and talk about B-17 because I had heard from a few reviewers that B-17 Queen of the Skies is still one of the best war games ever made. I mean, some of the guys when I was looking at war games, they were saying that was one of the best. Let's kind of go into that. When I first saw that game and you guys were playing it, it looked super boring to me. It was like the components were just these sheets of paper and it had an outline of the B-17 and you could see where the different crew members would be or where the machine guns were. Mm-hmm. And then you would determine, would you roll a dice to find where the airplane was coming in to attack you, the fighters?
Yeah, I believe so. Again, it's been, over, again, we're talking 1985 here. So,
sure.
But yeah, I mean, if I recall correctly, you have to find out, first of all, what kind of aircraft. The game itself is a little bit tedious. I would love to see it revised, re-released.
New graphics and stuff.
Well, yeah, the graphics were okay. I mean, I didn't have a problem with it. I think fundamentally, again, all those things that you were saying, you're dealing with all your crew member and where the angle of attack is. So again, if somebody is attacking you from the tail, of course, your tail gunner is going to be most susceptible for being shot at.
Sure.
And I would like to see all of those charts removed. I mean, that's the big problem with this. There's hundreds of little charts that they look like you're out of a geometry class. They've got all these things.
Sure.
And you're checking it out and trying to find out exactly where you're coming in for the attack. And anyway, if they were to clean that up just a bit, so it's not so, I guess the term is maybe fiddly.
Right.
I would love it. I mean, I would certainly be looking to buy it because, again, it's when we played it, I remember enough to know that it can be relatively fast. It's not one of these long, and again, the games at the time, you're talking again back to Avalon Hill, those games were 3-4 hours long, maybe
right.
more.
I remember you having games set up from that Napoleonic game you were talking about earlier, that you would have it set up on a table and it would sit there for weeks because, you didn't have enough time for a whole afternoon because I think that game looked like it would take a whole weekend. I mean, one of those,
probably.
that Napoleonic game. And
yeah, I mean, can you imagine? Hey, you get your buddies together and you're like, okay, let's spend the weekend in a basement somewhere and play it. It's like, well, it's just not realistic.
Some war games are that way.
For those people that do it, it's fine. I mean, that's their business, and
they enjoy it. Yeah.
I'm glad that there's games for them, but that's certainly something that I can't do.
Yeah, I had called you a little while back watching on a YouTube video where they put posted these guys the top 10 war games, and Queen of the Skies was quite high. It was like 3 or 4, and such an old game. So then I called you, and I said, hey, you should have seen this video. They were talking about the game, and they were saying that there's actual like tournaments that they go, and they have like a 17th Air Force, I think is what it is, right? 17th?
Well,
17th?
historically it was 18th.
Oh, the 18th, okay. And so they'll have like a whole Air Force with the same amount of planes and the same, and you get your airplane's name, and they have these gigantic halls where they put, everyone has their own plane, and they all go in together in formation, and one guy's a leader, and to me, I was blown away.
Were you saying that they had, like, they gave them, like, you know, jackets and whatnot?
Well, yeah, people dress up. They role play, basically.
I mean, if you're going to do it, just do it.
Yeah, and honestly, I was blown away. I was like, that is so cool. I would love to just even watch. That would be cool to me. To watch. I mean, I know I sound probably crazy when I say that, but I'd kind of like to see that. It'd be neat.
After about 10 minutes,
probably.
Like,
that's probably true.
Yeah.
After about 20 minutes, I'd be like, okay, I've seen enough. Yeah. Maybe if I went onto YouTube, I could probably watch it, maybe.
I mean, I think for me, watching somebody play a board game is rather boring. Unless, of course, I'm watching a video to, like, learn how to play a new game.
Yeah.
But, again, that's another topic for another
Well, let's kind of get off of that and go back to board games, because I know you don't really play war games anymore. But like, what's your favorite board game now that you play?
Well, it really depends on my mood, to be honest. I like more sometimes of the interactive games where you're involved. Like, that's why I kind of shy away a little bit from the Euro type games.
Right.
I just don't think, you know, it's sort of like solitaire in a multiplayer sort of setting, you know. Mm-hmm. Last night we played the game Coal Barons. That was a Euro type game, and we were playing it. We had a great time with it. You know, it just fitted.
Well,
really
that game, I wouldn't even, Coal Barons doesn't seem like it inherently was a interactive game, although we were interacting because we were having a good time with it.
Well, it was a worker placement
game.
Therefore, in my book, it's a Euro game.
Yeah, and we're really interacting. Before that, we were playing this afternoon. Well, yeah, we played Fresco and we played Escape. And Escape was very interactive. Because I'm like, I'm cursed, you got to help me here. And then we're running back, you know, we're going back and forth. And you got to do this, you got to do that. And that to me is super interactive. So that would be probably right up your alley. That kind of thing.
Well, I think, again, like, depends on my mood. I mean, sometimes I want more of an interactive game, and I admit I have leanings that way big time. You know, I think maybe the older I get, I do enjoy the Euro game if it's a tight game and it's something that I enjoy. I really have enjoyed my Pandemic game, especially I've gotten to the point where I don't enjoy learning a new game all the time, and that seems like all I'm doing. Because you and I, we've not been in this board gaming world very long.
Right.
So it's, you know, we've got some catching up to do as far as learning.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I have a few variations. And I always look for a game that's kind of fun, like my Conquest of Planet Earth game that I picked up. I have not actually yet played it with anybody, but it's something that I'm looking forward to, and that's more interactive.
Yeah, it's pretty interactive.
And it's a little silly to boot, and, you know, we can have fun. And I think with the right people, that game would work very well because you can just sort of, you know, take me to your leader type of thing.
Right. And I can hear all the little jokes going on with that game.
And I think with the wrong people, you know, and I guess you can make that statement about most games.
Yeah, most games. Yeah.
I think, well, you know, if you've got that, you know, again, a Euro style where you don't have that much interaction, you can just have, you know, basically a corpse sitting next to you, and you can play it through, and, you know, no big deal. But I think with the more interactive games that I like, finding the right kind of people for that is pretty important.
Right. Well, you just picked up Exodus Proxima Centauri. I can never say the name of that darn thing.
Exodus Proxima
And you
Centauri.
just picked that up. Now I'm pumped. I'd love to stick around. Of course, I got to go back to Arizona here, but I'd love to. It's that we don't live closer. I'd love to play that game. I'm just super pumped about it.
Yeah, you know, and I realized when I was looking at picking it up, there's two versions. Obviously, the original printed version, and the one I have is the revised edition. It cost a lot more, but you know what? It really is worth it. And
it's worth it when you see those components. Because see, I remember the components when I was watching some of the reviews, and all the ships were like either white or gray or something, and these had actual colors on them, and the individual player boards have like really cool graphics with like glowing little
top shelf
readouts. Oh, it's awesome!
It's very top shelf.
They did a bang up job.
I'm very happy I decided to, because sometimes depending on what it is, if it doesn't look that much different, I may go down the cheaper route, you know.
Sure.
Again, depending. But, you know, the way I look at it is, in this case, I mean, I do like good graphics in my games, but especially with a futuristic space game where the graphics would really mean a lot more.
Right.
I'm certainly that's why I kind of go at that.
Now, we, in this little interview that I've got going here, was kind of giving this a sort of wargamey flavor to it. So let me ask you, Twilight Struggle. Now, I had borrowed it from a friend, and I brought it to California so we could play it. We don't know the rules all that well, so we just kind of shelved it for now. But last time you played it, I know you've played it before.
Yeah.
Now, see, and the reason why I'm asking about this game is because for quite a while on Board Game, it was like #1, and I of course I've not played it. So why do you think it's a good game?
Well, let me first, for those people that don't know, Twilight Struggle is a Cold War, Russia versus United States, basically a board game that way, and it's strictly for 2 players. And it's a game that, for me, I'm sort of a history buff, military history buff mostly, but history buff nonetheless. And I've always been interested in that because of the Cold War. And in fact, I knew a few people that don't even play board games that I would love to sit down and play this with. I think they'd have it. For this person that I'm thinking of, it would be a great intro for him to board gaming because of just the strong theme.
If someone's into history, you mean?
If somebody's into history, in this fact, my friend Paul,
Paul,
yeah, he teaches, and in fact, he's kind of a 1950s or 1960s. I don't know. He's obsessed with it. So for him, it would be great.
He's like a retro dresser. He dresses like he's in the 50s.
No, not so much.
Or he's just into that time era.
No. I mean, he's just into that time era.
Okay.
I mean, everything that he. Yeah. Anyway, I sat down and played it. Again, it was my first try with the first. Again, I've only had one shot at it, but I liked it. It was. I wouldn't say it's a war theme, but it. Cold War. And. There's a lot of political and influence that you do. In certain countries, you can attempt to overthrow the government, to put in your own government if you're either the communist side or the United States side. Mm-hmm. I liked it. I thought, and in fact, while we were playing it, a few people came over and said, wow, it's such a great game, man. So
yeah, people love it, boy.
I think that tells me right off the bat it's a real tight game. And I'm looking forward to not probably playing it this week, and we're just probably not going to have time. But
yeah.
I know the guy that I met at the coffee house who played it. I'll be looking to play it again very soon, hopefully.
Yeah, because, I still would like to play it. When I say war game, I don't mean it's necessarily a war game. Necessarily, it's a light war game with lots of influences going back and forth between communism and the Cold War.
It's a political game is what I would call it.
Okay. Oh, well, then that probably would be a more
international political.
Yeah, a more accurate thing then. Okay.
And the thing is it's got real pictures of real people, and you're doing it in certain eras. You start out in the 50s, and certain events that are going on. Trying to get Europe and Berlin and the whole thing after World War II, and then it moves into the 60s with the Cuban Missile Crisis and Kennedy. Where the guy was telling me, because I was playing the United States, he said if you can hang out to the end of it, that's where the U.S., the Ronald Reagan era, that's where the U.S. becomes very, very strong. So there's different strategies. If you're the communist, you probably want to, anyways, you want to come out strong in the beginning, and that's how it plays out. So.
Well, the fact that it has such a strong historical theme, and they have like real people that are in the game, that is a way, because you and I have talked before about games drawing you in, and I think with it having real people and some of the historical realities in it, like built into the game, I think that's a thing where it can draw in a historical nut.
Right.
So
and I think something else though, I always like games that games that attract me are games that you can learn something from. Listen, all games are great if that's just what you like, but I always like walking away learning something. And I have to say, Twilight Struggle, if there's for high school, college kids, if they're kind of into board games, they could learn so much from this game.
It's fun
because there's historical events that you're dealing with.
Sure.
And I'm telling you, if I've learned from games in the past, some video games or whatever, I've really learned a lot. In order to play the game, you have to learn the historical behind it. And anyway, it's a great teaching tool if you can stick it out.
Yeah. Well, and we're coming up on our time limit here, but let me just sort of kind of end it with this. What is great about board games, and one of the things in our podcast that I bring up all the time is what's so great about board games. And of course, in the Fillet episode that we had talked about, Ken had suggested that board games are a social lubricant, that it gets people, it sounds kind of like a naughty term here, but it really does get people to socialize
But like what you're bringing up a great point too, and I think we've talked about this before on another episode. But the fact that you're learning, you're interacting, bringing different makes and models together of people, but that learning aspect is what you're talking about. You're right on.
And board games, I think, and you and I have talked about this in the past. Board game also, because the nature of the manufacturing of the board games, especially with the Kickstarter, that has allowed games that would not necessarily just a common guy to make up something and given enough effort and pushing it and he really wants it. I think we've all benefited from those Kickstarter games, and the only other outlet for anything like that would be video games. And now you're talking about all this investment with the CGI and all this
graphics,
effort, and because of the very nature of that, you just don't get the kind of different types of games you get from board games. And I think alone it opens worlds to us that we would never be able to do otherwise. And I do agree with that comment. I think socially it's great, depending on the game, of course.
Sure.
I mean, I don't. Like I said, if you're going to sit down and play a Euro game, I don't see socially that it's going to. Like, I've seen some pretty dry games. I think. No offense to anybody, but Lunar Rails I saw was playing a few times at our gaming thing, and it's a bunch of old guys sitting over this map of the moon and plotting out on little markers, and no interaction whatsoever. That's great for them. I'm not judging anything, but the social interaction phase with that, I wouldn't say so much. Again, depending on the game. Because of the nature of board games, it's allowed a game like Lunar Rails to actually exist. And I think, and those guys love that game. God bless them. That's fine. And there's nothing wrong with that. And for that reason alone, it's great.
Okay, Chris. Well, thank you for coming on the show. We're here in California, and coming from Arizona, it's always hot there. But I looked at the Weather Channel. It's about the same temp. So I came from one good temps to another. So that's cool. Okay. Well, thanks again. See you later.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait. These attacks continue as I speak. This conflict started August 2nd. Tonight, the battle has been joined.
Thank you for joining the Huff-N-Stuff podcast. We hope you enjoyed listening and hope you can tune in next time. Huff-N-Stuff is brought to you by Southwestern Valley Gaming Group at swvalleygamingsgroup.webs.com. You can visit us on our webpage at huffnstuffpodcast.webs.com. That is HUFFNSTUFF podcast.webs.com. We love to hear from you, so leave us questions, feedback, or just say hi. As always, keep on smiling and game on.
Hey, Chris, thanks a lot for doing that interview.
Piss off, whatever.
What? What do you piss off? What?
You heard me, jerk.